Saurabh sir has also joined. Pawan Sarda sir, I'm just trying to calling Pawan Sarda sir. Maybe he will be also joining shortly.
Welcome, Pratik sir.
Hi Ram, how are you? Welcome everyone. Hi Sunil.
Hello Pratik sir.
How are you? Long time to see you, all of you.
Yes sir.
Good.
You sir.
Hello.
तो तुम चली जाना 15 मिनट में, मैं तो बैठूंगा, मेरी क्लास है.
Sir, can you upload the presentation now? I think so. Smith sir is also joined.
Hello.
Is it visible?
Yes, sir. Can you do? Full screen is there now.
Yeah, I think we should start now.
Yes, we can start.
Yes. It seems Dr. Smith is traveling somewhere. Joining from the way.
No, he's wearing a mask. I don't think.
Yeah, that's it. He looks like traveling in a car.
More message actually. If you see in the chat message, sir, I am on the way home. Please start. So Smith sir is requesting kindly start. Sir is home, and then he will join. I think.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
So when should I start?
Sir, right now you can start, sir.
We can start, sir.
Should I start, Pratik sir? Okay.
Yes, sure.
Doctor
Start.
Introduce you and.
Yeah. Hello. Getting any?
Please go ahead and introduce the speaker.
Okay, I'll introduce. I'll do the honors for Dr. Ram. So welcome everyone to this wonderful session of IVUS for PCI optimization. And today we have a very esteemed speaker, our own Dr. Ram Chitlangia, who is working in Jaipur for past many years in Jeevan Rekha Super Specialty Hospital. And I come to know about his advancements in that area, that the hospital has progressed under his guidance. And today Dr. Ram will tell us how to use IVUS for PCI optimization. So handing over to Dr. Ram. Welcome, Dr. Ram.
Thank you, sir, Prateek sir. Thanks for a kind introduction. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome all, my seniors, juniors, teachers. Today's topic for the PGI cardiology class is IVUS for PCI optimization. I will deliberately not touch OCT, and actually I'm covering only IVUS for PCI optimization. Although I am not an expert for IVUS, but I will try to do justice to this topic to my best of my capabilities. So, to start, I would like to cover this topic in various headings, like the traditional method of imaging, that is by coronary angiography. Why do we need intracoronary imaging, that is ICI? Then the comparison of coronary angiography versus IVUS, followed by basics of IVUS imaging, basics of ultrasound, what are the prerequisites for good imaging, then what are the artifacts and all these things. Then there are two major things for PCI with IVUS, that is, one is planning of PCI with IVUS, and second is optimization of PCI with IVUS, basically pre-stent implantation and post-stent implantation. Then on follow-up, we can do assessment of device failure, basically stent failure. If we have some restenosis or some other complication after stent implantation immediately or maybe on long-term follow-up, then these imaging are of utmost importance or for assessment of these kind of failures or restenosis. Then I will briefly touch IVUS versus OCT, who has got upper hand, what are the advantages and basic disadvantages of each of these imaging. Both are complementary, but definitely there are some upper hands in one modality. Followed by complications, limitations, future directions, and conclude the presentation. So as we all know that traditional imaging modality for coronary anatomy and guidance of PCI is coronary angiography, which is basically a two-dimensional luminogram, and it does not depict the three-dimensional picture of the coronary arteries. So there are basic limitations of coronary angiography. It cannot depict arterial vessel wall. It cannot show you true vessel dimensions. What is visible may not be true. It cannot tell you what is the type of plaque, what is the morphology, what is the plaque burden. And also it cannot assess the acute results of a stent implantation, whether the stent has landed well, whether it is malposed or underexpanded. So it's just by visual estimation, it cannot tell you very accurately that what has happened to the stent, and if there is some problem with the stent, then what is the reason. So we need some additional imaging modalities needed for pre-procedural assessment and post-procedural optimization. So as long as around 30 years, these modalities are under development, and the first modality was intravascular ultrasound. That is a ultrasound-based modality, and basically we want to look inside the artery by a three-dimensional picture. So what is the need of ICI? Basically it is for pre-procedure planning. That is, what do we want to know? That is lumen dimension, vessel dimension. We want to characterize the lesion. What is the type of the lesion, whether it has got fatty plaque, fibrofatty plaque, or calcific plaque. We also want to know the accurate stent length and sizing, and also we want to know which strategy of stenting we should use. Suppose in bifurcation stenting we need to go for one stent or two stent, then also intracoronary imaging is of utmost use. Then post-procedural level, we can do a strut level evaluation of stenting by one of the modality of intracoronary imaging, and we can also additionally use optimization measures if we find that there's some stent is malposed or underexpanded, or it is not optimally placed, or we can use additional stent if it is required. So what are the options for intracoronary imaging? We do have right now we have only two modalities which are popular. One is intravascular ultrasound and second is optical coherence tomography. So I would like to touch the IVUS in detail. Coming to IVUS versus angiography, it has shown significant favorable effect on restenosis and TLR with the neutral effect on MI or mortality in the era of BMS, that is bare metal stents. As long as the DES era has started since around 2000 or 2003, there are multiple studies have been published from 2010 to 2016, and very large studies have published. One of the largest studies, IVUS, XPL, and CTO IVUS. They have shown a consistent favorable effect of intravascular ultrasound as compared to angiography guided PCI. So these two major studies has shown significant reductions in major adverse cardiac events mainly via decreased repeat revascularization. So no major effect on mortality was seen, but definitely repeat revascularization was decreased in these two trials when we used IVUS versus only angiography guided stent implantation. Another meta-analysis which was published of 8 trials of around 3,200 patients, it also showed significant reduction in MACE, TLR, TVR. Although it is important to stress that many of these trials or most of these trials, whatever they decided for predefined stent optimization targets, they could not reach those targets in many of the patients. As many as 20-30% of the patients, they could not reach all the target. Still, with whatever targets they could achieve for stent optimization, effect of IVUS was there in all of these studies in the terms of decreased repeat revascularization. So for all comers setting like IVUS uses in every lesion, the effect of IVUS on mortality benefit or MACE benefit, it still needs to be established. There was one study of ADAPT-DES which included 8,500 all comers patient, and it also showed, it was an observational study, not a randomized control trial. It also showed that most pronounced benefit of IVUS was in ACS patients and complex lesion subsets. So in routine simple lesions, the effect of IVUS still needs to be established. These are the various trials which most of these trials shows benefit of IVUS over angiography alone in MACE, cardiovascular deaths, and myocardial infarction and TLR. Most pronounced IVUS effect was seen in left main interventions due to abundant data available as compared to OCT. It showed in left main intervention, it showed lower risk of MACE and trend for lower mortality. Because of the effects of IVUS, we usually do undersize the size of left main and we probably do not expand it fully. So effect of IVUS was on in left main intervention was with the larger stents with better expansion. So after imaging, we definitely started using larger stents, more frequent stent post dilatation, because many times we see that stent we have deployed a stent of 4, then we dilate with 4.5 or 5, especially after IVUS, and also with the less use of 2 stents. So if side branch is okay, the other circumflex ostium is okay, then probably we would like to go with 1 stent. So IVUS also helps in optimization of left main stenting and lesser use of 2 stents. So coming to basics of IVUS imaging, it is basically IVUS images are based on reflected ultrasound waves from tissues, which produces the electrical impulse converted to image. And it has got 2 fields, that is, one is near field and one is far field. So always near field image quality is better, and length of near field is shown by this formula, where R is the radius of transducer and lambda is the wavelength. So basically for smaller vessels, we need smaller transducers with smaller radius and with higher frequencies. That's why we use IVUS catheters of 40, 50 or 60 megahertz in coronaries, while the routine echocardiography we use 4 or 6 megahertz probes. So for smaller tissue, we need a smaller transducer with higher frequency probes. It has got two types of resolution. One is axial resolution, that is around the circumference of the artery. The axial resolution is always parallel to the beam and it is a function of wavelength. And lateral resolution is perpendicular to both of the beam as well as the catheter. It is a function of wavelength as well as transducer side, and it is typically around 50% of axial resolution. So when the IVUS catheter rotates, it can show you the images on the circumference very clearly, but along the length of the artery, the image quality is usually inferior to the axial resolution. Another type of resolution is contrast resolution, that is ability of IVUS to see differentiate between black or white and some shades of in between. So it is basically a distribution of grayscale of the reflected signals, and it depends on the properties of tissue, whether it is a fibrous tissue or fatty tissue or calcific tissue. Calcific will be reflected more, so it will be more white, and the soft tissues or highly lipidic tissue will be reflected less, so it will be more black. Coming to image acquisition during a intravascular ultrasound examination, we should always use a motorized pullback device for a good image, good and consistent image quality. It is usually, pullback is usually in the 0.5 millimeter per second pullback, and the average pullback length is around 100 millimeter for one artery. So we can do a good size of the artery can be evaluated, around 10 centimeter of artery can be evaluated in one pullback. Sometimes we can use, or we do use, manual pullback to verify focal and specific findings. Suppose we are not able to appreciate some finding during the mechanized pullback, so we can stop at one point of space and we can do some dynamic review, and we can see the plaque morphology or some edge dissection we can easily identify, which is probably not possible in OCT, because OCT is not a real-time imaging while IVUS is a real-time imaging. We should always try to look that imaging run should start at least 20 millimeter distal to the lesion, and it should end at the ostium of the artery, maybe left vein ostium or RC ostium. So we should evaluate from distal of the lesion, we should evaluate the complete vessel in one run if it is possible. Sometimes we are unable to cross the IVUS catheter, which is the crossing profile is around 2.6 or 2.8 French. And we may need balloon predilatation for non-crossable lesion, because otherwise it is difficult to pass the IVUS catheter across these lesion. And co-registration with angiography is an ideal tool, especially when we do want to use the stent landing zones. So it is a good thing if we have co-registration with angiography in our cath lab. There are mainly two types of IVUS systems are available in the market. One is the mechanical IVUS system, and second is the solid state design IVUS system. So basically, grossly, that Boston Scientific has got mechanical IVUS system, and Volcano system is a solid state design system. In mechanical system, there is mechanically rotating transducer, which rotates at 1800 RPM speed to sweep a beam almost perpendicular to the catheter. And it provides for every image 256 individual radial scans. So there's the image quality is very good in rotating systems. The transducer spins inside the protective sheath, the plastic sheath. So it needs flushing outside the body. Importance of flushing is very important, because to be emphasized, because if we keep some air bubble inside the sheath, then our image quality will go down very badly, and we cannot flush the catheter inside the guiding or inside the coronary, because it will amount to an air embolism inside the coronary. So it needs to be properly flushed outside the body, and then it has to be introduced inside the guiding catheter and the coronary. The other system is the solid state design system, which has got multiple element array mounted on the catheter. They are electronically switched by the console system, and one set of element transmits while the second set of elements receive simultaneously. So it rotates by the way of sending and receiving impulses, while the actual catheter does not rotate, but it activates and deactivates. The arrays got activates and deactivates at different points of time. So it is called sympathetic aperture array, and mainly Philips Vulcan system has got this solid state design system, but the mechanical rotating system has got the better image quality overall. These are the catheters. Grossly, if we can see that over the guide wire, there is the monorail catheter. It goes inside the coronary, and there is a rotating element on the top cartoon, which is the rotating type of system. And while in the solid state IVUS system, the guide wire is in the center of the lumen, and these are the multiple orange arrays which are mounted on the catheter, and they activate and deactivate at different point of time to generate a image across the circumference of the artery. These are the main IVUS catheters available across different companies. Main companies are Philips and Boston Scientific, and also other companies are Assist and Terumo, which are probably not available in India. The basic transducer frequency is around 20 megahertz, but nowadays mostly we use 40 megahertz catheter, 40 to 45 megahertz catheter, and Boston Scientific and Assist, these have got a high definition catheter that is of 60 megahertz, and it gives you the best axial resolution with OptiCross HT. Most of these catheters are compatible with 5 French guiding catheter, And there is also one important thing is transducer to tip length, which is around 20 millimeter in Boston Scientific catheters, while in one is Volcano Eagle Sight short tip catheter, it is around 10 millimeter. So especially while you are assessing some CTO via the side branch, probably short tip catheters are of more of use as compared to long tip catheters. But still, most of these catheters do justice to the imaging in day-to-day practice. So how does the normal coronary look like on IVUS? It is usually a trilaminar structure, which we know and we can see on the histopathology. So it is made up of the intima followed by media and followed by adventitia. So innermost layer is a complex of intima and atheroma, which might be present in diseased artery and internal elastic lamina. So these three things constitutes the inner membrane, innermost layer. If the artery is not diseased, then definitely there will be intima and IEL. But if there is atheroma, then it will come in between intima and IEL. The middle layer will be the black, which will be the less echogenic due to present muscle inside it, and it is media. And outside of media, there is adventitia and periadventitial tissue, which you cannot differentiate probably between these adventitia and periadventitial tissue. There is no definite clear-cut boundary. So outside of these things is adventitia. One important thing is external elastic lamina, which is a discrete and quite reflective interface between media and adventitia. And this forms the basis of measurements in most of the IVUS studies and day-to-day practice. And we do measure mostly EEL, cross-sectional area, to get the lumen size and to get the atheroma volume and plaque burden. And we detect all these parameters from EEM cross-sectional area. So EEM is a very important landmark in IVUS imaging, and we should always look for EEM when we are calculating on the IVUS images. One thing is important, that all three layers may not be appreciated in all cases, because sometimes there is calcium and sometimes atheroma volume is very high or fibrous plaque is there. Then we may not appreciate this true trilaminar structure, and we have to assume on some images of IVUS regarding the external elastic lamina. Coming to some of the definitions which are used in IVUS measurements. One is the proximal reference site and one is the distal reference site. So these are the sites with largest lumen, proximal or distal to stenosis, but within the same segment, that is around 10 millimeter. So this may not be the site of maximum plaque burden, but these are the largest lumen which we use for landing of our stents. Third is the average reference, because some studies use the distal reference site, some studies use the proximal reference site, and some studies use the average reference. So it is the average of both proximal and distal reference lumen. So you add up these two and divide by 2. That gives you average reference lumen diameter, and you size your stent according to that average reference. Lesion is called accumulation of atherosclerotic plaque compared with the predefined reference size. So predefined reference lumen, we have to decide that this is the normal segment, and then where there's some atheroma on other side, then it is called lesion. And when the lesion is more than 50% lumen compromising lesion, it is called a stenosis by cross-sectional area. Now the IVUS measurements which we need to measure on the images, that is, one is the lumen cross-sectional area. This is the area which is bounded by the luminal border. So we have to see the lumen, where the lumen, that is the intima and internal elastic lamina, and we have to mark that lumen, and on measuring this area we will get the lumen CSA. Minimum diameter will be the shortest diameter through the center point of the lumen. Luminal area stenosis will be reference lumen cross-sectional area minus minimal lumen cross-sectional area upon reference lumen cross-sectional area. The important thing will be the atheroma cross-sectional area, that is what is the plaque area. So usually we take the EEM CSA, that is external elastic membrane CSA minus the lumen CSA. So that gives us to atheroma CSA, and this atheroma CSA is usually equal to plaque plus media. But we can discount media easily because that media area is very small area. So it is actually not a single plaque area, it is plaque plus media area, cross-sectional area, which is called as atheroma area. And plaque burden or atheroma burden is equal to atheroma CSA upon EEM CSA. That gives rise to percentage of plaque. And after stent implantation, we can see the cross-sectional area which is subtended by the stent. So we mark all the stent borders, and stent cross-sectional area can be derived from a stent, this marking. So these are the basic definitions. Another important thing is aneurysms, which we find sometimes in the IVUS examination. Sometimes there are true aneurysms, and sometimes there are pseudo-aneurysms. So true aneurysms are the lesions which include all the 3 layers of vessel wall with an EEM, and luminal area should be more than 50% larger than the proximal reference site. Then it is called eligible for aneurysm. There may be some ectasia, but aneurysm is only called when the luminal area of that area is more than 50% of the proximal reference segment. Pseudoaneurysm are present usually after the balloon dilatation, and there is disruption of external elastic membrane. And pseudoaneurysm can be found during intervention, or maybe sometimes after intervention, just after balloon dilatation. If we see on later on, then pseudoaneurysm can be found. Only thing we have to decide regarding the true and false lumen, especially when we are doing the CTOs. So true lumen has got all the 3 layers, and side branches must arise only from the true lumen. It cannot arise from the false lumen. False lumen is usually parallel to the true lumen, and it does not communicate with the true lumen over a portion of length. So we have to be very sure regarding true lumen and false lumen while we are using IVUS for this intervention in CTO or long lesions. Coming to some of the artifacts of the IVUS, one of the most important artifact is the non-uniform rotational distortion, and it is very unique artifact only linked to the mechanical system. That is, it is not found in solid state design system, and it is due to mechanical binding of the drive cable. So there is distortion of the image at cyclic distortion of the images in IVUS imaging. It is usually due to bends in artery. It may be due to tortuous guide catheter or kinked guide catheter. So it does not allow the drive shaft to move this rotation inside the protective sheath. It can be due to excessively tight hemostatic valve, which does not allow the rotation, kink in the imaging sheath, or very small guide catheter lumen. Suppose sometimes guide catheter lumen we are using the 6 French optic cross and 5 French guide, so it can be difficult to get a good images, and also it can be due to manufacturing defect from the IVUS catheter. Also, there are some other motion artifacts which can occur from the non-stable guide catheter position and the vessel movement during image acquisition. Sometimes RCA moves very across very broad range, so we can get some motion artifacts. Other artifacts are the ring down artifacts, which are the bright halos of the variable thickness around the catheter by acoustic oscillations in the transducer. So as you can see on the top panel, there is some small bright rounded halos across the catheter, which are known as ring down artifact. Then there can be blood speckle artifact, which can be due to with increased transducer frequency, or it can be due to slower blood flow or in the presence of some thrombus or highly thick blood. So it limits the ability to differentiate the lumen from the blood. So and it gives rise to poor image quality. So blood speckle artifact is also possible. Sometimes we need to give some nitroglycerin or flush the catheter, guide catheter properly to remove this artifact. Other artifacts can be due to obliquity of the vessel or eccentricity or vessel curvature. These can give rise to image which can give to false impression of the elliptical vessel. And transducer obliquity in large vessel can result in overestimation of dimension and can lead to reduction in image quality. So the best image quality is there when catheter is always coaxial with the vessel and beam strikes the target at the 90 degree. If the beam angle of beam is somewhat different in tortuous or large vessels, then image quality always naturally goes down. Then also there are some problems with the IVUS catheter regarding the spatial orientation. So absolute anterior, posterior, right, left, we cannot determine in IVUS images. But in some systems, if we mark some branch, then images can be rotated electronically and we can have some spatial orientation. These are another examples of the artifacts. On the top left panel, we can see the acoustic shadowing behind the calcium. So whenever there is calcium, these sound waves cannot penetrate the calcium, and there is black area behind the calcium. That is the reason the IVUS catheter cannot tell you the thickness of the calcium. So it just goes black beyond the calcium, and it is a very reflective surface. So it gives you bright white image. From calcium, there can be reverberation artifact. It can arise from calcium. So if there is a calcified plaque, then there can be multiple reverberation artifact arise, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of calcium after the first calcium incidence in the artery. So it can be due to reverberation of this thing, and also a stent can produce the multiple reverberating images, and you can see the 1 or 2 or 3 struts in the IVUS image which are actually false, not true. Then there can be air bubble artifact. If we leave some air bubble inside the sheath, then the sound waves cannot penetrate the air very well, and obviously the image quality goes down drastically even with the new catheter. So you have to take out the catheter from outside of the guide catheter outside the body, flush it properly, and then reinsert it to remove these type of artifacts. So we need to recognize these artifacts regularly so that we do not get confused during IVUS imaging, and probably some of the artifacts can be removed with some tips and tricks. Now coming to the optimization of PCI, what do we achieve or what can we achieve with IVUS or any type of intracoronary imaging? So if we do imaging before PCI, we can recognize plaque severity and vessel sizing. We can recognize the type of the plaque, whether it is a calcific plaque or fibrofatty plaque or fibrous plaque. We can see some spontaneous dissections in the vessels and act accordingly, or plan a longer stent or something like that. So we can have a better selection of PCI strategy and devices. The type of debulking we can decide, stent type we can decide, and sizing we can decide. If we are doing imaging during stent implantation or after stent implantation, we can recognize easily stent malopposition. We can recognize tissue prolapse. We can recognize stent under expansion and edge dissection, and we can make corrective steps by selective uses of additional interventions like stents, balloon, adjunctive drugs, whatever we want to do. So reduction of peri-procedural complication and improvement of clinical outcomes due to lower risk of ISR and thrombosis is possible with optimization of PCI with one of the modality of intracoronary imaging. Now I will touch these topics one by one. So I will start with PCI planning. So before PCI, how can IVUS help to us, and what all we can see during imaging before stent implantation or before balloon dilatation or after balloon dilatation. So one of the softer point is significance of stenosis, which is not the domain of IVUS, but also it can help in sometimes. Although we all know that in today's era with all the trials, FFR is the gold standard for knowing the functional significance of stenosis, or whether this is stenosis is ischemia creating or not. But still, IVUS MLA is also a modest correlate of FFR, and it can be used especially in left main stenosis where FFR has got certain limitation during measurement. So from various trials and studies, optimal IVUS MLA cutoff ranges has been identified, and it ranges from 2.1 to 4.4 millimeter square for non-LMC lesion and 4.5 to 6 millimeter square for LMC lesion. So overall grossly rule of thumb is 4 for non-LMC and 6 for non-LMC lesions. Below that, you are bound to get adverse outcomes, and you should probably treat these lesions if you do not have FFR to assess, or you cannot assess FFR by some other problem. But if you find these value should not be used to justify interventions unless substantiated by FFR. So FFR is definitely gold standard, and IVUS is secondary to know the functional significance of stenosis. In this picture, we can see that on CT coronary angio in panel A, there is a moderate looking stenosis. On coronary angiography, it is rather milder looking stenosis, and probably it is quite underestimated. But if you see the IVUS images of the same stenosis, the MLA is around 2.5 millimeter square, and probably it warrants intervention after uses of FFR, or the patient is symptomatic then without uses of FFR. So sometimes it helps in knowing the significance of stenosis, but also it is not gold standard for that. Then coming to the plaque morphology or lesion assessment by IVUS. It can characterize the plaque morphology, whether it is lipid-rich plaque or fibrous plaque or calcific plaque, where angiography has got low sensitivity but high positive predictive value for detection of calcific plaque. IVUS is superior for detection, localization, and quantification of coronary calcification. So most important for calcified is for calcified plaque, which is strongly predictive of stent delivery failure and stent under expansion. So if you are not able to detect calcific plaque on angiography, and we are able to see it on IVUS and regarding the degree of calcification, then we can avoid these type of stent delivery failure or under expansion, and we can have a better clinical outcomes on long term or short term. There is a calcium index, which is the product of angle of calcified arc and its longitudinal help, and it can help in determining the quantification of calcium inside the coronaries. Also, detection of these calcified plaque can help determine extent and modalities of plaque modification required, whether we require some kind of balloon type of lesion modification with the IVL or cutting balloon or scoring balloon, or we require some type of atherectomy device like rotablation or orbital atherectomy devices that can be decided with the assessment of these plaques by IVUS. IVUS naturally cannot penetrate calcium and can detect only the leading edge of calcium, so it cannot determine the calcium thickness, which is an important parameter for plaque debulking or plaque modification. At this point of time, OCT scores over IVUS because there are light waves and which can penetrate the calcium, and it can probably tell us some calcium thickness. So OCT overscores the IVUS regarding assessment of calcium thickness, and it gives us better outcomes in detection and treatment for calcium. On IVUS, there can be superficial calcium or the deep calcium. Superficial calcium is the calcium where the leading edge of accosting shadow appears within the most shallow 50% of the plaque plus media thickness. Basically within atheroma, if the calcium is within the shallowest 50%, then it is superficial calcium, or if it is in the deepest 50% of atheroma, then it is deep calcium. Also, we can measure the arc of the calcium in degrees, that is 60 degree, 90 degree, or 180 degree, or 270 degree of arc of calcium across the circumference of the artery. Or it can also be defined as in quadrants of calcium, that is 1 quadrant, 2 quadrant, 3 or 4 quadrant of calcium. So IVUS can help us in determining, it is very sensitive for calcium detection, but it cannot determine the thickness of the calcium. These are the various calcified plaque. On A panel, you can see there is a calcified plaque on with a small arc, which is probably very much amenable to some routine balloon dilatation. Panel B is showing some calcium nodule, which is sometimes difficult to dilate alone with balloon and requires additional modalities. Panel C is showing a large calcium arc of around 180 degree, and panel D is showing a circumferential calcium, which may require additional modalities for plaque modification other than the routine balloon dilatation, or some type of atherectomy device might be needed. Other plaque types are the soft plaque or hard plaque or fibrous plaque or mixed plaque. These type of plaque can also determine the need of cutting balloon or scoring balloon, especially with fibrous plaque. And also these can tell us by telling us the morphology of the plaque, they can tell us the chances of microembolization and slow flow, especially with highly lipid-rich plaque. So on panel A, this is normal coronary. B will be the soft plaque, where the chances of microembolization and no reflow will be very high. Fibrous plaque on C will require some additional type of lesion modification, and type D is again the calcific plaque, which requires some type of atherectomy devices. So after lesion assessment, what type of plaque is there, we can see that what is the plaque burden. So plaque burden is defined as ratio of atheroma area to SL/EEL, and as I've already discussed, it is plaque plus media area. And usually non-culprit plaque burden more than 70% is associated with long-term MACE events in prospect trial. And also virtual histology IVUS in some of the machines can help in thin cap fibroatheroma detection, although OCT is much superior for that type of application for getting the more finer details in plaques. So for one example, a small example, which of a left main disease with mid-LAD disease, we did an angiogram which is showing some moderate kind of disease in LED of 60 to 70% stenosis and some plaque on left main. And this patient was referred to us for ostial left main stenting because he had some pressure damping on ostial left main hooking. But when we did the angiogram, there was no pressure damping. So we decided to go for an IVUS and FFR guided PCI of this lesion. So initially we assessed the IVUS of the left system from LED to left main. And as you can see, there was from distal LED, we can see initially some normal coronary followed by starting the plaque. And gradually the plaque burden increases across the mid LED. Plaque burden is getting more and more, and there is some branch coming in at around 9 to 10 AM. Another branch comes in and the LED size grows larger and larger. And there is circumferential plaque burden on this video. Gradually the plaque burden increases in the proximal LED, and as you can see on the right side, there is a huge plaque burden of 83% on this in this LED. Then plaque burden regresses in the ostial segment of LED. After ostial segment, the circumflex comes in, and circumflex is quite clean. As you can see, there is minimal plaque in the left main from 2 PM to 6 or 7 PM, and it is okay. So we did stented the mid LED, and we did perform the FFR after stenting the mid LED, and the FFR was normal. So probably we changed our intervention strategy from stenting of left main ostium to mid LED stenting. Actually, patient was referred for ostial left main stenting, but there was actually lesion in mid LED. So we stented the mid LED and FFR was normal after that in both the LED and circumflex. So it can change your intervention strategies by determining the lesion assessment and with the help of FFR. Another important aspect for IVUS uses is stent diameter, because in all the studies it has been shown that stent under expansion is the most powerful predictor of early stent thrombosis and restenosis, and appropriate stent sizing and expansion is of utmost importance. So there is progressively larger approach to larger stent sizes. We can choose either smallest reference lumen diameter, then we can choose the mean reference lumen, that is average of proximal or distal. Then we can choose the largest reference lumen diameter, either proximal or distal, or we can choose the smallest reference EEM diameter, because EEM is on the most outer side of the atheroma. So this shows the progressively aggressive approach to the stent stent diameter chosen. So as you can see that on the OCT also the same thing applies, and it chooses the stent from most conservative approach from 3.3 millimeter to 3.7 millimeter in this case. And also in IVUS, it chooses from the most conservative approach, it chooses the stent of 3.4 millimeter to 4.1 millimeter. Overall, on an average, IVUS gives you a larger stent diameter as compared to OCT. So it always helps you putting a larger stent as compared to OCT, because it gives you a larger EEL based area. There can also be an eccentricity index regarding choosing a stent diameter, that is ratio of maximum to minimum plaque plus media thickness, and it is to define the eccentric plaque distribution. True vessel sizing and detection of positive and negative remodeling is also possible with IVUS, and the most practical approach is to use the mean distal reference diameter, that is mean of average proximal and distal reference diameter. It should be used. If you are using the lumen based sizing, that is the lumen based cross-sectional area, then always you should upsize the stent by 0.25 millimeter. And if you are choosing the external elastic lamina based sizing method, then you should always downsize the stent by 0.25 millimeter. So somewhere in between will be the mean distal reference diameter, will be the most practical approach. For the stent length, we should choose the optimal stent landing site, that is the IVUS derived normal segment or the area which has got the plaque burden less than 50%. If we land the stent in area more than 50% plaque burden, and particularly in lipid-rich plaque, it will lead to stent restenosis on follow-up, and also incomplete stent coverage of lipid pools will lead to microembolization and periprocedural MI and no reflow. Co-registration is, again, as I mentioned previously, is very important for stent landing zones and stent length and precise implantation of stent. So these are the various methods by which we can see the proximal and distal reference size, what are the appropriate side landing zones for stent, and we can measure the distance between distal reference and proximal reference and appropriately choose the stent length according to that. And with proper expansion, we can achieve a good stent CSA area in any of these cases. So for IVUS, for guidance of stent implantation, IVUS versus angiography IVUS leads to larger stent diameters, greater angiographic MLD and MSA, and more and longer stents. While IVUS versus OCT, OCT gives a small but smaller stent size in OCT and larger stent in IVUS group while applying the lumen-based sizing approach. But there is no difference in outcomes overall whenever whatever strategy we use in stent sizing. In Illumin 3 EEL based distal reference sizing approach, there was no difference in stent diameter noted in IVUS versus OCT. Now coming to the PCI optimization, IVUS intracoronary imaging can predict the stent outcomes by recognizing the various correctable abnormality like underexpansion, geographical miss, malapposition, stent edge dissection, tissue prolapse. And stent underexpansion with resultant smaller MSA is the most important determinant of early and late stent failure. So this is the most important thing among these 5 things to have your long-term outcome, that is the underexpansion. And it is the absolute underexpansion expansion rather than relative expansion which is more important. OCT is superior in many of the things like malapposition, stent edge dissection, and thrombus dissection over IVUS, but these outcomes, these parameters may not be of that clinical significance as is stent underexpansion is. So first is the most important for the good clinical outcomes. These are the various PCI optimization targets which were used in trials, starting from MUSIC trial which used BMS stents, to TULIP trial, RESIST trial, study by Musa et al., then the AVIO trial. All of these trials uses different criteria for stent expansion and the minimum stent cross-sectional area achieved. But the modern trial, especially after study by Kang et al., they used the minimum stent area more than 5.5 in non-LMCA lesion and stent area of more than 7 in distal LMCA and more than 8 is proximal LMCA lesion area to achieve the good outcome. And minimum stent area should be more than 80% of average reference lumen cross-sectional diameter or area. We should always avoid the extensive malapposition if possible and avoid large dissection and extensive tissue prolapses whenever possible. So these are the modern optimization criteria. I will come one by one to each of these. So predefined criteria in most of these trials were not achieved in all patients, but even by these criteria, even if they did the suboptimal PCI without achieving all the criteria in all of these trials, they led to more aggressive post-dilatation and larger MSA, and they improved clinical outcomes and hard clinical endpoints as compared to angiography guided PCI. So whatever criteria you can achieve, you may not be achieve the 100% criteria like no malapposition, no tissue prolapse or edge dissection, but whatever you are able to achieve or whatever you are able to do better, it will lead to better clinical outcomes. So universal evidence-based, practical and more consistently achievable criteria for IVUS PCI are still desirable, but from multiple studies, some criteria have evolved, which we will discuss. So what these PCI optimization can do with our stent, it can decrease the plaque overload, it can expand the stent satisfactorily, it can lead to avoidance of edge dissection. So with suboptimal PCI and optimal PCI, the target vessel failure rate comes down to significantly low as compared to suboptimal PCI in one of the studies which was published in 2018. Stent expansion is the major predictor of stent failure and it describes absolute MSA or compared with predefined reference area. So absolute expansion is always a better predictor than relative expansion. and more than 5.5 and more than 7 in distal LMCA and more than 8 in proximal LCM is best predictor of outcome. And MSA cutoff is more than 80%. It appears reasonable in clinical practice. In one of the study for defining the optimal minimum stent area, that is the optimal cutoff value for stent expansion, which was able to predict FFR of more than 0.90 was 79.4. So probably more than 80% MSA is a reasonable target in clinical practice to achieve for whatever the reference area we have taken, that is the average mean lumen reference CSA. We should achieve around 80%, more than 80% of that. So this is the rule of 5, 6, 7, 8, which is a very famous rule. That is, in a non-LMCA lesion, non-LED lesion, we should achieve at least 5 millimeter square of stent area. In LED lesions, we should achieve 6. In point of confluence, 7. And left main shaft or proximal left main, 8 millimeter square we should achieve. Below these areas, we are bound to get adverse outcome. Whatever you are looking, you are seeing that my stent is adequately expanded in LCX ostium or whatever not. But if this cross-sectional area is less than 5, then you are bound to get the adverse outcome or restenosis in near future or on late failure of the stent. So we should try to achieve these targets. Other thing is malapposition. What is malapposition? It is basically lack of contact of stent struts with the vessel wall. It is defined as axial distance of stent strut more than 0.4 millimeter from vessel wall. That is the contact is 0.4 millimeter away, and longitudinal length more than 1 millimeter. So these parameters will be considered as a significant malapposition. It can or it cannot coexist with the underexpansion. So it may be with underexpanded stent, or it may not. It may be with properly expanded stent. Still, the struts may not be opposed well to vessel wall. It can occur acutely just after stent implantation, and we may not know if we do not do some kind of imaging, and we can get to know later when we have some device failure on follow-up, or it can be on follow-up, which can be persistent, so which is ongoing since the PCI, since the implantation of the stent, or it can be late acquired malapposition due to the positive remodeling of the stent of the vessel. So differentiation on follow-up, whether it is persistent since implantation or it is acquired late, it is not possible, and it is usually due to vascular inflammation or positive vessel remodeling. This is the you can see the cartoon of malapposition. If we have baseline incomplete stent apposition like this, and if there is no vascular remodeling, sometimes it resolves itself by itself, and the endothelium covers these things, these struts, and it will be incompletely opposed, but usually it is resolved and without any clinical consequences. And if there is no vascular remodeling, then it remains as persistent or incomplete apposition, which is visible on later on imaging studies. Sometimes it is late acquired, that is at the time of implantation you have very well opposed stent struts to the vessel wall. But when there is without any vascular remodeling and there was a thrombus behind the stent struts and it does get dissolved, then you will see some late acquired malapposition, which may or may not be of any clinical consequence. And if the vessel undergoes the positive remodeling also, then you can get the late acquired incomplete apposition or malapposition. So from number 2 to number 4, it is difficult to distinguish whether it was a persistent malapposition or late acquired malapposition. Alone, malapposition is not a definitive predictor of stent failure. So whatever malapposition you leave, it may or may not turn out to be of a clinical consequence or some bad clinical outcome. It may resolve with time, and always OCT is a better modality because it has got the higher resolution, higher axial resolution. It is a predictor of very late stent thrombosis, but it does not lead to acute stent thrombosis. So it is a good thing that sometimes we do miss malapposed stent, but usually acute outcomes are not bad. Sometimes very late stent thrombosis happens. And whenever we find the extensive malapposition, it should be corrected whenever feasible after PCI. So especially in bifurcation PCI, there is increased risk of accidental abdominal wiring in malapposed stent struts. So we should always do some kind of pot while we are doing proximal these bifurcation PCI while recrossing the wires. so as to avoid these malapposed stent and avoid abdominal wiring, which can be catastrophic when you take the balloon across these struts. So malposition should be avoided whenever possible, but it is not a very bad, has got very bad clinical outcomes overall. Another thing is tissue prolapse, that is the prolapse of tissue or extrusion of tissue from inside the stent struts. It can be either lesion or it can be thrombotic material. OCT is always a better modality to detect these things because it has got better resolution. It is a definite predictor of early stent thrombosis and early adverse short-term outcome after the PCI. In ACS cases, the tissue prolapse is always more harmful than the non-ACS cases because of the microembolization and no reflow and periprocedural MI. While in non-ACS cases, it has been seen that usually they do resolve with time. And if you detect significant tissue prolapse, then you should optimize your PCI with some balloon dilatation or some thrombosection if possible sometimes. Regarding edge dissections, they also predict the early stent thrombosis, and the edge dissection can interrupt the intima, it can interrupt the media, or it can reach up to adventitia. So more extensive the dissection is, the more problem for you during PCI. Depth of at least disrupting media will be considered a significant dissection with lateral extension of more than 60 degree arc. That is, the arc of dissection is more than 60 degree and length of more than 2 mm will always be considered significant. OCT is definitely more sensitive as compared to IVUS for detection of these dissections. Dissection of more than 200 microns at distal edge of the stent, they are predictor of major adverse cardiac event, but not at the proximal edge of the stent. So distal edge of the dissection are always more important, and if they compromise more than 60% of lumen on IVUS or any other modality like OCT, then probably we should implant one more stent to correct these abnormality, because then they are indicator of early or late stent failure. So these are the grossly criteria of IVUS criteria for PCI optimization after stent implantation. One of the most important is rule of 5, 6, 7, 8, which we have already discussed. Extensive dissections with more than 60 degree arc, more than 2 mm longitudinal extension involving media or adventitia should be avoided. Any dissection or tissue protrusion resulting in MLE of less than 4 mm square is considered extensive and should be treated. Acute stent malposition more than 0.4 mm with more than 1 mm longitudinal extension should be treated. So these are the basic targets for our stent optimization after PCI. You can see the dissection criteria: plaque burden less than 50% at stent edge and no lipid pool, no extensive tissue protrusion, malposition, and then the stent sizing and stent MSA of average of more than the average MSA of reference distal plus proximal, and MSA of average reference lumen should be more than 80% of the whatever we have defined the average reference lumen diameter. So minimum stent area should be more than 80%, and there should not be any of these abnormality if you want to do a perfect PCI. Now we come to the advantages of IVUS in complex lesions. The more of clinical benefits of imaging are seen in more complex lesion. If you are doing simple cases and if you do 1000 cases, then probably you will not get significant clinical benefit as compared to when you are doing more complex cases, especially left vein cases, bifurcation cases, and cases in the settings of ACS probably. So there was mean compare trial observational study in which IVUS guided left vein PCI was used in 77% of cases, and 201 matched pair of IVUS guided DES PCI. Impressive 60% reduction of all cause mortality was noted at 3 years. Similarly, in another registry of bifurcation PCI, it was associated with IVUS guided PCI was associated with significantly lower death rates or MI rates. And if you can do side branch ostium IVUS, and if it is more than 2.4 mm square, it is sensitive in predicting the side branch FFR of more than 0.80 after main branch crossover stenting. So probably you can assess the side branch ostium, and if it is of good cross-sectional area, then you are unlikely to get some problem or failure of side branch after stenting the main branch, and you can just do pass an FFR wire, and mostly you will get a normal FFR despite significantly pinched side branch, maybe 80-90% whatever, and you need not do anything if FFR is normal. In CTO PCI, also IVUS can help us significantly. It helps in resolving proximal cap ambiguity. Commonly, the IVUS will be done from a side branch, and we can see where the proximal cap. You can see the proximal cap morphology. You can confirm the proximal cap puncture. You can confirm the wire location in relation with the true lumen. And also, recently, there are a lot of papers regarding IVUS guided wiring in CTO PCI, and especially 3D wiring, which is a little bit complex topic. And it is more of mental mathematics with 3D wirings in IVUS in CTO PCI. The advantages of IVUS in CTO PCI that you need not inject repeatedly integratedly in CTO PCI, which can lead to extensive dissections sometimes. It provides real-time 3D orientation of the vessel, and with the availability of short tip catheters, that is 9 mm tip catheters, IVUS catheters, and you can probably keep in a small side branch, and you can image the main vessel very appropriately. Now coming to the stent failure, that is on the follow-up after PCI. If the patient comes us with the device failure, there is some restenosis or some edge dissection or some problem with the patient, you can detect the IVUS or OCT must be used in the setting of a stent failure, unexpected stent failure. So it can show us restenosis, which can be due to neointimal hyperplasia or chronic underexpansion, which is seen in cases of device failure in 18 to 40% of cases. It can show us stent fracture, which is around 5% of cases. It can show us new atherosclerosis, especially which is new atherosclerosis more than 1 year after PCI. OCT is always a preferred modality for stent thrombosis and stent fracture due to its higher resolution, and it has got class 2AC recommendation for intracoronary imaging in cases of stent failure by ESC guidelines. Another topic was the failure of these biovascular scaffolds, that was the absorbed BVS, which was the only approved FDA approved BVS, and it is now out of market. So there was an increased risk of thrombosis after implantation, and particularly after 1 year. So they tried to investigate why this happened, and there was a registry of around 36 patient invest registry, and they could detect a new BVS specific phenomena, which is called as strut discontinuity or dismantling, which was seen in 43% of the patient. Basically, with the dissolution of the stent struts, the stent struts will get discontinuous or dismantled, and there will be dislocation of BVS struts into the lumen despite initial full apposition or after some degree of tissue coverage. Even after some degree of tissue coverage, if the strut breaks up, they can hang into the lumen, and which is probably leads to very late stent thrombosis, which was seen with BVS, and which led to the withdrawal of BVS from the market. So we have to find out what better we can do in the cases of BVS to avoid this phenomena and have a better outcomes in cases of BVS. So briefly touching the IVUS versus OCT, we can see that the IVUS has got the many advantages, and OCT also has got the many advantages as when you compare head by head. But IVUS has got the more rich clinical data for almost the last 3 decades it has been used. It is possible in most of the patients without pre-dilatation. It can see the whole of the vessel wall. Extensive research is available. IVUS predictors and parameters are more well established, and it is better guidance for CTO techniques like wire re-entry. The disadvantages can be difficult to predict or difficult to interpret the images. Tissue characterization will be limited. Thrombus detection, stent edge dissection, malapposition, these are relatively not good in IVUS because of the lower resolution as compared to OCT. While OCT is better suited for tissue characterization, calcium, thrombus detection, clear and cleaner images, it has also got some predictors of restenosis. The disadvantages of OCT we need to keep in mind, especially in renal failure patient, that is the need of additional contrast. Flushing is necessary. Although saline OCT can be done nowadays with good results, pre-dilatation is sometimes may be necessary. Limited penetration of light waves across the vessel. So in the larger vessels, OCT may not be useful when IVUS can show you up to 8 or 9 millimeter vessel. And compared with OCT, there is limited research evidence on OCT guided versus angiography guided PCI, and no adequately powered RCT for clinical outcomes till now. So this is another cartoon which is showing the pre-PCI, post-PCI and follow-up, where IVUS stands good, where OCT stands good, but more or less these two techniques are complementary and not replaceable to each other. We sometimes may need both of the techniques, but due to the financial feasibility, we have to use one technique at one time because they are costly affairs in the cath lab. So for severity of calcium and all these things we have already discussed, they are all are good. Mostly both techniques works well if you are using them appropriately. What are the complications of IVUS? The most common will be the vascular spasm because around 2.8 French catheter you are taking inside the artery and sometimes vascular spasm will be there. So always give NTG while starting IVUS examination. And if there is spasm, then wait, withdraw the catheter and again give NTG and take it gently or take a new catheter. Sometimes we use aux catheter and that can be cause spasm. Vessel dissection is possible, perforation is rare, acute vessel occlusion sometimes happen, and sometimes ventricular arrhythmia can also happen with the IVUS examination, which has to be treated in the usual manner. What are the limitations of intracoronary imaging as whole? One of the most important is additional time required for imaging, and sometimes we do not have patience for intracoronary imaging. The 20 minutes PCI may get up to 1 hour while we are doing a simple lesion, but in complex lesion we should always devote more time for imaging to get the better clinical outcomes in the acute settings or on the long term. Initial cost of procedure is, although it is high, but if you do the cost effective analysis, then long term it will be cheaper as compared to putting 2 stents or 3 stents rather than 1 stent. So sometimes it saves stents. Availability of equipment may be a consideration in some of the cath labs. Not every cath lab has got the equipment. And also there is issue of reimbursement by the government or the private organization or TPAs. Then the learning curve of acquisition of image and adequate interpretation may be there, but it is not very difficult. You can learn very well after 30-40 cases. And sometimes it is just not deliverable in calcific, tortuous, angulated, complex lesion. So there we cannot use intracoronary imaging and we have to just rely on our eyes and just the angiogram. What are the future directions? There are some companies which have integrated the infrared spectroscopy, that is light source imaging, into the IVUS catheter for the quantification and characterization of lipid core plaques. So basically we can see the morphology of the plaque, but exactly what is the lipid content and what is the type of lipid and what is the fibrous content we cannot see on IVUS. So this NIRS gives you better quantification and characterization, and it is based on property of different organic molecules to scatter and absorb light at different intensities and wavelength. Also, there is radio frequency tissue characterization available. Co-registration is with angiography, which is also widely available, and HD IVUS, which is little more costly than the routine IVUS catheter. It can be used with for better imaging, and sometimes it is comparable to OCT when you use HD IVUS catheter. So we can recommend routine IVUS imaging, especially in protected and unprotected left vein diseases, undilatable lesions where we are unable to dilate the lesion, ostial lesions where OCT cannot give you good results, bifurcation PCI, SVZ intervention, and especially device failure, that is in-stent restenosis or what has happened to our stent. Special subsets where IVUS guidance is recommended over OCT probably is autoosteal lesion, CTO PCI where OCT cannot be used, renal impairment patients, larger vessels more than 3.575 millimeter diameter vessel where OCT may not show you good images. And also when we need the real-time imaging, that we want to see the particular vessel at a particular spot, then OCT examination will not show you, while manual pullback IVUS will show you the discrete lesions with you can assess them properly for a more longer period of time. There IVUS will be scores over the OCT. What are the current guidelines for uses of IVUS? The most important will be the assessment of intermediate LMCA lesion after transplant and allograft vasculopathy to determine the mechanism of stent ISR, assessment of non-LMCA with angiographically intermediate stenosis, guidance of coronary stent implantation, particularly LMCA lesion, and determining the mechanism of stent thrombosis. In both the ACC and ESC guidelines almost say the same things. For the LMCA lesion, it gives you good recommendation, and for non-LMCA intermediate stenosis, you can use IVUS imaging. And especially for device failures, you should use IVUS imaging. So to conclude, intracoronary imaging is essential in modern day practice along with FFR for lesion significance. IVUS is relatively simple, easily available, and cheaper modality as compared to OCT. The learning curve is important but not very steep for the cases of IVUS. It helps both in pre-PCI planning and post-PCI optimization, and extremely important in cases of device failures. There are now expanding indications in CTO PCI for IVUS guided wiring. Both IVUS and OCT are complementary to each other and not competitor. And we need to move our mentality towards IVUS guided PCI rather than PCI with IVUS. So we should start PCI with IVUS and then do the pre-procedural evaluation, intra-procedural evaluation, and post-stenting evaluation to complete the IVUS imaging, rather than just putting a IVUS catheter at the end of stent implantation and see that everything is okay and come out. So you should plan with the IVUS and end with IVUS rather than do IVUS at the end. That is my talk regarding intracoronary imaging. Thank you for your patient hearing and listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram sir, for enlightening us with IVUS. Sir, I have one query. Like for diffuse lesions, when you are planning to stent only a focal part, what length of IVUS normal? IVUS normal is what you are saying, like normal or less than 50% of the plot. So, what length of that length will you consider fit for focal stenting, then covering the whole area? For distal
diffuse lesion, then probably we have to see some landing zone definitely. If it is more than 50% plaque area, then definitely there will be more chances of device failure on long term. And especially if there is lipid-rich plaque, then probably you should not land your stent there. And if you don't have any other place to land the stent, then probably fibrous plaque is a better place to land your stent, because that will have less chances of restenosis as compared to lipid-rich plaque. So otherwise, diffuse lesions, you have to, pardon?
What length of normal area will you consider fit for focal stenting, then to cover the whole?
Length of normal area. I really do not know what length of normal area we should consider, but we should have landing zone for at least 2 to 3 millimeters where we can land our stent. Probably. I think sir can tell us better.
So Ram, very nice presentation, exhaustive, covered each and everything, very nice. And as Sunil is asking about, it's the 5 millimeter area proximally and the distally, which should be disease free. And as Ram has rightly mentioned about, it should be say less than 50 or 40% plaque burden. Otherwise, there is the risk of geographical mismatch and risk to have an in-stent restenosis. And basically, it's going to lead into in-segment restenosis. That's the area which is likely to have an in-segment restenosis. So a 5 millimeter distance proximally and distally, and a plaque burden less than 40% or 50% is the one which is desirable for a long lesion. And otherwise also for any lesion, you have to take care of this thing, or you have to follow this. Yes.
So can we dream of a contrast-free PCI now with our IVUS in?
Ram, any comment about?
Yes, sir. Probably a lot of people are doing now. You cannot say contrast-free PCI because that is for our mental satisfaction sometimes. But a lot of people are doing PCI in 20 or 30 millimeter of contrast, 30 ml of contrast, especially in renal impairment patient or LVF patient or with very poor LVs.
Yep.
So they are just doing one shot at the start and one shot at the end with 5 or 7 ml of contrast and one shot in VP.
So
it is possible.
15 days, and there I saw they just took one shot prior to the procedure and one shot after the procedure. That's all.
That is for our mental satisfaction probably.
Yeah. I have seen one Australian operator in CTO.
So here to add. Yes, Sunil, please.
Yes, sir. I have seen one cheap CTO case. So the one Australian operator was there. It was extremely calcific triple vessel disease. He put, I think, some 5 or 6 stents and not a single dose of contrast, all with the imaging modalities only. So angiography, because they have a system of getting it. So angiography has been done with contrast at some other place. He retrieved all those images electronically and did the whole of PCI not giving a single contrast.
For that, basically, you need co-registration. That is, if you have co-registration, it becomes very easy. Right? Exact thing is seen on the screen, where you have to plan your stent. And
so with what sort of practice we are doing, I think two cine with the contrast is very much essential. First one is to localize the lesion and artery, of course. Second one is to look for any slow or no flow phenomena after the intervention, or any complication like say perforation. So these are the two things which definitely do need the contrast injection. Otherwise, rest of the thing can be guided with the intracoronary imaging.
One more question is like, sir, you are saying something.
No, please.
We have seen a lot of cases by sir during our residency while sir was doing PCI with 30 or less than 30 ml contrast in renal failure patients. I do remember a lot of cases.
Yes.
Without imaging also.
So stop DAPT2 used IVUS and OCT, and they stopped DAPT quite early, 1 month, 3 months.
1 month.
Same is with detect OCT. So can we again rely on IVUS and stop our antiplatelets well from dual to single antiplatelet within a month or 3 months? Or we can just start, we have finished a good apposition and good result in PCI, and we straight away start with one single antiplatelet rather than going for dual antiplatelet from day one post PCI. Where do you think that can we achieve that, or are we achieving that?
I think
So,
not.
I really do not know whether the 1 month DAPT is minimum, but some of the basically we do not have the liberty to do an imaging at the end of 1 month.
No, it's post PCI, immediate post PCI. You have finished your
Immediate
PCI,
post PCI,
and
you achieve good outcomes.
yeah.
You
so
can interrupt.
Ismit, there is data with Giants, with Resolute, and few other stent that with a good optimization following the PCI, you can very well stop dual antiplatelet therapy after 3 months of continuation. And this is very nice that in case you do have a good opposition with, say, a good expansion of the stent area, which is more than, say, 5.5 millimeters square, no malopposition, you can safely decrease or reduce the dual antiplatelet therapy after 3 months in most of the cases. There are few studies which is also available where you can safely drop down dual to single antiplatelet therapy after 3 months of dual antiplatelet continuation. So this is something good. One more advantage of doing the optimization is that you can safely reduce the dual antiplatelet therapy after 3 months. Most of the third generation drug-eluting stent has shown the data that there is good endothelization in case you have done the intravascular imaging at the end of 3 months. So this is one important thing which can be practiced.
Yeah, from day one there is one thing. Whatever be the, size of
3 months that the data is already there. You have stopped DAPT2 and detect OCT trials. But probably we are moving towards day one that we can decide these patients are very safe, small stent, good results. We can straight away think elderly population, maybe after 75, where you feel that bleeding, or CKD patient bleeding through it. So we are moving probably towards that.
But sometime will be definitely taken by endothelization. You cannot expect complete
endothelization. There are good antiplatelets now available. So
yes, second antiplatelet. So either of the two have to be achieved. The second antiplatelet should be more stronger with less side effects. So that will, because ultimately endothelization is required, and that will take some time.
Right.
So you cannot get it from
probably 3 months minimum would be required. I think, sir, there are no questions.
Ram, there was an acronym initially when this imaging and FFR has come into the practice, that if you want to do PCI, do IVUS. If you don't want to do FFR. So what do you say about it?
Sir, somehow I have done limited number of cases, but definitely I would say that FFR results in also in more stents sometimes. And we do miss some lesions which are intermediate and really FFR is positive, and sometimes where do we implant the stent is not the correct site of stent and the lesion is somewhere else in the artery. So we do miss some arteries. So actually it is not correct that FFR leads to decreased stents. It does lead to exact appropriate stenting. And IVUS is definitely for stent optimization, not for decision of making implanting a stent, except in very few circumstances of left main stenting or austere LAD stenting, where we can probably think of IVUS results. Based on IVUS results, we can implant a stent.
So probably I find the FFR results whenever we are thinking of a side branch which is pinched. There it avoids express stent.
There it is.
Most of the time,
that is very good application.
There is an anatomical eyeballing mismatch with FFR. I don't know. Sir has more experience.
So I would say that both are different things. FFR is the one which is going to assess the functional significance of the lesion, while the imaging, which include both IVUS and OCT, is going to describe the anatomical significance. With acute coronary syndrome or myocardial infarction, you cannot rely on FFR. So here, of course, you have to see for that, okay. Second thing, those with the unstable plaque or with a high plaque burden where the FFR can be, say, more than 0.8. But if you anatomically feel like that, okay, this is a patient with acute coronary syndrome and the symptom is because of this ulcerated or high-risk plaque, then there is a need for the PCI. So these are not the substitute, complementary to each other, both FFR and intravascular intracoronary imaging. So that's one thing. And then in one of the cases, Ram, you have described the role of FFR for like PCI to the LAD. What is that? As we routinely do the FFR across the lesion before the PCI, and then you have rightly mentioned that doing FFR after the PCI. So what's the importance of FFR following the IVUS imaging, following the stenting across the lesion?
Basically, sir, in that case, we got the referral for that case of ostial left main disease. And for stent, we took him for ostial left main stenting, and there was written from outside that LAD lesion is 50%. So we first did the imaging, which showed a significant lesion in LAD, and IVUS followed by FFR, FFR followed by IVUS, and then we stented the LAD lesion, and then we did the FFR of LAD and L6, and left main lesion was naturally not significant, so we could avoid the stent at the left main. So in that case, after stenting the primary lesion, the FFR turned out to be negative for everything. So we could avoid some stent in left main. So it is important to see the functional significance of lesion.
Nice.
So I think we can end if there are no questions from the audience. With your permission, sir. Right, sir. We'll meet after 4 weeks.
2 weeks or 4 weeks?
4 weeks.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. Very nice lecture. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone.